phrenic vessels up here. And I'll re-diagram just these alone because it can be confusing on this diagram. Middle, our branch of the aorta, and inferior come off of the renal arteries. Okay? So 37 is superior, 38 is middle, 39 is inferior. So let me diagram that separately here just so it's not quite so distracting with all the other vessels that are in there. I'll leave this side off because then I have to draw the other half of it. Now I swore this morning, the second time I drew it, I was going to move everything down a little bit more because now I have all this space and only two more sets of vessels to draw. Notice how, this doesn't even look like a kidney. Notice how, where the kidneys are, along the posterior abdominal wall. What other set of organs are intimately related in their development to the development of the kidneys? The gonads. Remember how the mesonephric ducts and paramesonephric ducts, the mesonephros is our intermediate kidney? They're both developing along that gonadal ridge. So guess where the origin of our gonadal vessels are? Up high, close to their development, not where they are now. And so the next pair of vessels coming off of the anterior portion of the abdominal aorta are the gonads. These are relatively thin. If they are testicular arteries, they're going to pass through the inguinal canal along with the testes. If they're ovarian arteries, they're going to pass down into the pelvis, so we see them associated with the suspensory ligaments. Okay, if we don't know what's down there, ovaries or gonads, then we just call them, ovaries or testes, we just call them the gonadal arteries. And then finally, we have our blood supply to the descending colon, which is going to go to the left. And this is the inferior mesenteric. It divides, I guess I erased my intestine there. It divides and sends a branch along the descending colon, known as the left colic. And a branch goes to the top of the rectum, known as the superior rectal artery. We're going to come back and look at this when we look at middle rectal and inferior rectal. So you can learn this in sequence. The wire models and some of our torso models will just show the coming off of the aorta. But when I can, I prefer to have the organs around, so it's a lot easier to recognize the renal arteries when you can see them going to the kidneys. It's a lot easier to recognize the superior mesenteric artery when you can see it giving branches to the small intestine or to the ascending colon. Okay. One last set of vessels. Remember our posterior intercostals? They continue to come off of the aorta, but when we're in the abdominal cavity, we no longer call them posterior intercostals. Remember how the external obliques were found between each of the ribs? When we get to the abdominal wall, we no longer have the ribs, and so we call them the external obliques, but they're essentially the same orientation of muscle. So when we're in the abdominal cavity, and we're going to draw them here, even though they're all the way along the posterior abdominal aorta, we call them lumbar arteries. So they come off the posterior aspect of the aorta. Just like the posterior intercostals. And they're going to supply posterior abdominal muscle, deep muscle of the back, and the spinal cord. The spinal cord gets its blood supply from several vessels along the way. So it gets it from the vertebral arteries at the very top, but often those don't make it all the way down, and so these additional vessels pass into the intervertebral artery and supply the spinal cord. And I had my students, when I was at Sac State, do a case study on an abdominal aneurysm. The gentleman was driving home from work and had a thinning of, I don't know if it was a splitting or a balloon-type aneurysm, I don't remember, but the aneurysm ruptured. Of course, the abdominal aorta is under high pressure. And it must have been the splitting kind. If it was the balloon, he would have died before he reached the hospital. But he drove himself to the hospital before he passed out. To repair the aortic wall, they had to ligate off the blood supply above the aorta. And they saved his life, but he became a paraplegic because the lack of blood supply from the lumbar arteries to the spinal cord caused the spinal cord to die from lack of blood supply. And so the lower sacral nerves did not receive innervation, did not receive enough blood supply to keep them alive. And so the muscles innervated by those lower sacral nerves were paralyzed.
Wow.
All right, so before we move on to, actually, we do pelvis and then we'll do lower extremity. So if we trace a drop of blood from the heart to the ascending colon, same standard ascending aorta, arch of the aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. Now if we're going to ascending colon, are we going to do superior mesenteric or inferior mesenteric? Superior mesenteric. Boom, we're there. Okay? Pretty easy. Aorta all the way until we took the artery that traveled to that organ. Okay? All right, before I show some illustrations of these areas, let's do the pelvic area, and then we'll be done with common iliac